Hello and welcome to the Organic Wine Podcast. I'm Adam Huss, coming to you from Los Angeles, California. Thank you so much for listening. I want to give a special thank you to those of you who have begun supporting this podcast by subscribing to our Patreon. Your support is the soil that makes it possible for this podcast to flourish. And I hope that you know, by equating you with dirt, that's one of the highest compliments I can give you. If you're not already a Patreon supporter, I'll include the link in the show notes. Thank you so much. Also, we have some great sponsors for this episode. is a company that is making it possible for the wine industry to begin reusing glass bottles. Go to earth. That stands for Our Only Mission is Earth. Go to earth and let them know you've heard about them here. Also, Catavino Tours is a sponsor, and they offer luxury wine and food tours in Portugal and Spain. And you can support this podcast by checking them out and having a fantastic time on a tour with them by going to catavinotours.com/OWP. And I saved our sponsor Vermont Vineyards for last because for this episode they are topical. Vermont Vineyards is a family-run business owned and operated out of small-town Vermont. They design and install vineyards of all shapes and sizes, and they aim to reduce the stigmas attached to hybrid grape varieties in New England wine regions. Check them out at vtvineyards.com/OWP, all lowercase. That's vtvineyards.com/OWP. Now, when I think of Vermont, I think of slanted light and moody skies, wildflowers and rosy cheeks, small farms and big forests. And because of my guest for this episode, when I think of Vermont, I also think of hardy vines and delicious wines. Deirdre Heekin is the person behind La Garagista and Domaine de la Foret, along with her husband Caleb, and what seems to be a continual stream of young winemakers who help and learn and have become the next generation of Vermont wine. Deirdre is a restauranteur, vigneron, writer, photographer, mentor, gardener, and more. And that means we cover a lot of ground in this conversation. We talk about the magic of the forest and why grapevines are integral to the forest edge ecology that we aim to replicate with holistic regenerative agriculture. We talk about Deirdre's approach to farming Brianna, which involves not pruning it. Very interesting. She also shares some of the unique approaches she has developed for making cider and wine and co-ferments and other things that don't even have names by gleaning from ancient techniques and by learning from nature and the opportunities it presents to work with it to create one-of-a-kind fermentations. Enjoy. Oh, and just a special note, there was a bit of an audio delay between the two of us when we were recording, so at times we talk over each other and overlap each other a bit. It's not terrible, just want to give you a heads up, but it shouldn't prevent you from enjoying this wonderful conversation with Deirdre Heekin. Deirdre, thanks for doing this. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Adam. It's great to be here.
I am really excited to talk to you because I feel like so many of so much of your journey, though, we're obviously very different people and different things, and so there's so much reflection of my own in what you're doing. And I guess maybe if as a way of warming up, I'd love if you wanted to sort of describe what's happening, where you are and what's happening on the farm this time of year, like, in any way that you'd like to.
Okay. Well, it always seems to be a busy time on the farm. I keep trying to figure out when a downtime is, but right now we are just on the very verges of spring. The farm is comprised of 4 different parcels. We have the home farm, which is the main place where the winery is, and our original vineyard. And then we have a vineyard right across the road. Those are both up here in the mountains. So we're on a certain time schedule up here. And then we also have 2 parcels down in the Champlain Valley. In the mountains, we're at 1,600 feet. The Champlain Valley is just a little bit above sea level. So that's at a very different time and place in its season at the moment. So we start getting spring anywhere from, well, it used to be a month earlier than in the mountains, but now it's about 2 weeks, I would say. So we've been 2 or 3 weeks without snow down in the valley. We've got daffodils and tulips starting to poke up. We've got willow trees that are that sort of beautiful chartreuse green. And we are
Mm.
still in pruning mode over there. We have a very long pruning session, as it were. We try and start at some point in December, and we're working pretty much up until mid-May between all the parcels. So in the valley, we have all this spring actually really starting to happen. And then up here in the mountains, we still have, I'm looking out my window, it's probably about 8 inches to a foot of snow in places. We have a lot of bare ground also. I can see into the orchard, and underneath the apple trees, it's bare, but then you see lots of white snow. And we're still pruning here.
Wow.
And I did notice over the weekend that as the snow was starting to recede up here, that we've got daffodils starting to poke up out of the ground. Whereas in the valley, the flower heads are already up, and they're about. In fact, when I go there tomorrow, I'm sure they're going to be blooming. So we sort of get these two springs in terms of the climate, which is fun and interesting
Mm.
and gives us this sort of beautiful extended period. But
Yeah,
uh,
that
yeah, so
anything that
we're
extends spring is okay by me.
it is good. So we've got that happening, and we've got pruning in all places. We also are waiting to bottle cider and our co-fermentations. The way we make our cider, we do a lot of the work from January through March, and then we're in a period of waiting for sugars to drop so that we can bottle for sparkling. So before talking to you this morning, I was up in the winery checking bricks on all of those cuvées. And so that's happening. We're starting to discourage pet nats. We're doing a little bit of travel for sales. Um, Caleb's got seeds starting for the gardens. And we were just talking this morning at our morning meeting about starting to dig holes for some new planting that we're doing. So we've got kind of a lot going on.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah. Um, and I should say it's April 10th, as
Yes.
just a frame of reference for whenever
Yeah.
this comes out. Um, so now you've got my mind curious about some things that I'll just riff on before I forget. But the cider. So because you're not inoculating, I'm imagining it's just a slow ferment. Is that what's happening? You started in late winter and then it just takes this long.
Exactly. So we have a process that we do with our later apples in which we hold them. We try and finish picking them in November. Sometimes we go into December, and we hold them for a period of
Hmm.
time out in the cold. They live in a barn, and they freeze and thaw, freeze and thaw, freeze and thaw with the fluctuations of the diurnal temperatures here and whether we're freezing
Right.
or thawing, because there is such a thing here known as the January thaw. And we wait for a certain amount of time until the fruit has really concentrated. And then the apples come into the winery, they completely thaw, they get ground into mash, and then they go into open fermenters where they will hang out for anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 or 3 months. And then they get pressed off. And after pressing, then they're at a certain amount of sugar. I think this year we had one of the highest bricks that we've ever had for apples. I think they
After
came
press.
in, yeah, well, yeah, after press, they were at about 17
Or at the
bricks.
beginning too.
Right,
Oh,
exactly.
after press, you're at 17.
They were at 17.
Wow.
And normally, yeah, we're hitting like maybe 13, 14. So then it is very cool in the winery at this time of year. So it's this sort of lovely, long, slow ferment. And we start, if we're doing co-ferments, so for example, for me, when I co-ferment with wine, I'm taking a base wine that I've made in the fall of, say, 2022, and I am blending that with this new cider that's just come off the press. And I'm either blending to the exact bricks that I want for bottling at that moment, or I'm blending to what I think is the right flavor profile in that moment and then waiting for the sugar to drop as it co-ferments together. It just kind of depends on what our sugar levels are and how much of cider we have, how much of the still wine that we have. So it's a really interesting process.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. The when you say blending for immediate bottling, so you're using the apple juice cider as a sort of tirage for
Exactly.
sparkling.
Exactly, but it might end up
Got it.
being a 50-50 blend.
Got it.
So
Okay.
it's not just a little, soupçon of
It's not just
cider
a
to
dose.
yeah, exactly. So it might be a significant quantity, but it would allow us to, control our bottling schedule rather than being, beholden to it, which we are at the moment.
Yes, yeah, I feel that.
Yeah, yeah. But I
Well,
really, I love this process because we're constantly looking for more ways to work with our environment and our climate with both the wine and cider, and being able to use the cold weather of
yeah.
winter in this way. It has been a really beautiful revelation and evolution.
Oh, I love that. I mean, I love the idea because I think so much of how your journey has been and your approach to wine, as it seems, and please feel free to correct me and expound upon this, but it seems to be this study of nature and how to, how how you integrate your life into it rather than the other way around, and you know, starting with food and the way that food can just be this thing that surrounds you, is abundant in your world because you're essentially walking through a landscape of delights basically.
Yes, yeah.
um d- d- I,
That's really beautifully
I
said, I'm
one
gonna
of
steal
the
that. I love that idea of that, and really accurate. I mean, it is all a study of nature and our environment and how I can be a part of that and work with it rather than impose my own notions upon it and try and control it. And I'm always, kind of surfing that edge of what is wild. And
mm,
that to me is where the interest is and the creativity is. It's like thinking about forest edge ecology, that methodology and that belief that the excitement of the natural world happens on the forest edge. And that's
yeah,
what I and we are looking for in the way that we're approaching our farming, the way we approach our cellar work, the way we approach life.
it's funny. Yeah, yeah, I recently was reading, and I wish I could remember what I was reading, but the author was talking about how they they were from a suburban environment, and they're like, I'm going to go see the abundance of nature, and they hiked out into the middle of like a wilderness area of just forest, and they were like, they didn't hear a bird, they didn't see an animal. It was just trees, it was just a canopy and a bare floor in the
Yeah.
deep forest. And they were like, what is going on? Like, in my suburban backyard, there's more going on than this. And that's when they started learning about forest edge ecology and how like tending the wild, to borrow that term from MCAT Anderson, is really managing the entire ecosystem for that abundance of the forest edge ecology. And I I really love that idea as well. I mean,
Yeah.
so much
Yeah.
of, like, I think what you talk about with your approach being this permaculture biodynamic approach is that, like, the food forest food garden thing is that, for having a continual forest edge in the entire landscape.
Right, and it's all
And
collaborative. It's all collaborative. All those
yeah,
plants and the flora
right.
and fauna, whether it's wild animal life or raised animal life that's part of your ecosystem, they all speak to each other. And that's where
Mm.
that excitement and creativity is, I think.
You One of the things that I was reading from you that really intrigued me was, you talked about this old wild vine that was an inspiration for you, sort of a muse for the entire farm. Can you talk about that? Is that is that accurate? what I've said?
It is. I walk by that vine every and visit that vine every day, or almost every day. It I think it was that vine and vines like it that are on our property really brought home for me that vines are a part of my landscape, naturally, wildly,
Hmm.
historically. When I first started thinking about making wine, and there was a wine community here before us that had done a lot of hard work, had put in a lot of infrastructure, figured out what kinds of varieties would work here. Everybody I had talked to, and especially since we have such a big cider community here and orchards are such a big thing, a lot of people would say that, vines were the interlopers. Cider was a more natural companion as a fermented beverage for the world of New England, the world of Vermont. And when I really zeroed in on the fact that vines have been here natively since essentially the beginning of time, and that apples actually are imported here. They are not. They've taken very
Right.
well, but they're not indigenous to this part of the world. It really struck
Right.
me, and being able to see that particular vine on our property, and we've got some other vines that go down the stream bed, and then I started seeing them everywhere here. You see them in the
Yeah.
hedgerows, you
Yes.
see them in the forest, you see them on the highway. They
Yeah.
literally are everywhere. And that was really, yes, inspiring and made me understand how much a part grapevines are to this landscape, and that even though the vines that I work with are hybrids and they're crosses, they contain that the DNA of those wild vines that grow here. They contain that family
Yeah.
history. And to me, that's a pretty wonderful and exciting thing.
Yeah. I really love that as well. I'm definitely inspired by them as too. And you're right, like once you start seeing them, you can't unsee them. You see them everywhere.
Right.
You get vine eyes,
Exactly.
kind of thing. It's like mushroom eyes, mushroom hunting eyes too
Yeah.
from the
Yeah.
forest. Um, the I the the thing that I find really interesting that I guess I share with you to a certain extent is how gardening sort of lured you in, like piece by piece into. It seems like, I mean, again, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm fishing for something that isn't true, but I've found for myself that like I learned so many important lessons just in gardening and there's something as I started really analyzing or just thinking hard about why that was, especially I mean how it informed my viticulture and everything else. Outlook on life was it was something about working in the dirt and also learning what it took to grow food, to grow it well, to be able to actually provide for yourself. Did you have that experience? I mean, can you relate to that? Does that resonate as well?
Yeah, totally. We started gardening here at the farm. Well, Caleb and I had a restaurant for about 20 years, and we started gardening about 2 years after we opened our spot, which started out as a bakery and a restaurant. And part of the impetus for gardening, and we had gardened before, for vegetables for ourselves, but for the restaurant at that time, this is in the late 90s, we were wanting to grow really specific vegetables for our menu. And they were vegetables that we had, or varieties of vegetables that we had come across while living and working in Italy. And at that time, for example, nobody was growing radicchio. Now, of course, everybody's
Hmm.
growing radicchio. But in 1998, 1999, that was really hard to come by, particularly here in Vermont.
Hmm.
So we started growing things that were part of the Italian kitchen, and the vegetables led to fruit trees, led to wanting to be a part and have a role in shaping the landscape that we were living on. And I think you were saying something about this progression leading you down
Yeah.
path. And I think by the time I got to planting vines, I felt comfortable enough I had tons to learn
Yeah.
and still have so much to learn about all kinds of gardening, whether that's in the orchard or roses or vegetables, what have you, vines. But I felt comfortable enough to plant vines without really knowing what I was doing, because I hadn't had any
Nice.
study of that process. I knew from being in my career as a wine director and a wine educator, I knew enough about the cycles of the vineyard, but I had never had an opportunity to do it myself. So I really only knew the treetops, if you will. So those first few years were incredibly informative. Even having a little bit of the gardening experience that I already had, because as you well know, working with perennial plants is a completely different story than working with annual plants, and that's not something that I think most
Yeah.
people think about.
Yeah. Uh, It's so different that I actually feel like I made the same mistakes twice because there are some similarities, like the thing that I learned with tomatoes, like with tomatoes, for example, the first big lesson for me was like, if you want to if you actually want to get a crop of tomatoes, there's like very two different ways of approaching it. You can either use chemicals to ensure, that you're fighting off blight and things like that, or you can enhance the resilience of your tomato vines and use resistant varieties. And I feel like I had to relearn all of that with vines. Like, oh yeah,
Right,
resistant
right,
varieties.
yeah.
Like instead of just planting the same, things based on popularity or flavor, what people consider comfort, I guess, more than flavor. I used to say flavor, but I feel like that's not fair to hybrids that have fantastic flavor as well. But that natural resistance is really important in what you're planting.
Right, right, exactly, really
And
important.
since I'm jumping back to what you were saying about hybrids, but um, can you talk a little bit about that? Like how the hybrids that you're working, what are the hybrids that you're working with, and what have you learned about them over the years that you've been doing?
Oh, I so much. The hybrids that we're working with are considered cold climate hybrids or varieties. And I think pretty much everything that I have planted has come out of the University of Minnesota's horticulture program. University of Minnesota and
Hmm.
Cornell are probably the two biggest and most creative northern horticulture
Yeah.
programs out there. Cornell has hybrid varieties that they are working with as well. And then there's some private horticulturists on their own farms who work on their own, but they work also in tandem with either of those universities. And I'm working with kind of,
I
I guess they would consider the
I was
classics.
just going to interject. I also Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, 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 you go
Go
ahead.
ahead. Sorry. Oh, I was just going to interject that I recently found out about the breeding programs at Arkansas and Texas that seem pretty robust as well. I mean, they're definitely not the size of Minnesota and Cornell yet, but they've produced. I was surprised to find out how many new varieties have been produced there as well.
Yeah,
And different
particularly
climates, obviously, it probably wouldn't be as
exactly.
applicable to Vermont, but
Exactly, exactly. And
but
Texas for a long time has been always kind of at the cutting edge of horticultural work with grapes,
yeah,
ever since
yeah,
phylloxera, so and pre-phylloxera. So
yeah.
um,
And
that's not
Missouri,
at all surprising to hear. Right.
yeah, right,
Um, so our hybrids, I think, the ones that we've planted here at La Garagista are sort of the classic northern hybrids. We have La Crescent, which is a white. We have Marquette, which is probably the most well-known red, along with Frontenac Noir.
hmm
There are two sports of Frontenac Noir. There's a Frontenac Gris and a Frontenac Blanc that we have planted. We
hmm
have Saint Croix, which is an older vine, as well as the Frontenac Noir is also older We also have Brianna, which is a
Yeah.
white grape, and we have that in one of our vineyards over in the Champlain Valley. So we have 7 altogether, and we have co-plantings in each of the vineyards. The 2 vineyards at the home farm here in the mountains have the same co-plantation of 6 different varieties. And then in the Champlain Valley, we've got 4 in the Vergennes vineyard, which is Marquette, La Crescent, Brianna, and Frontenac Gris. And then in our West Addison vineyard, which is right on Lake Champlain, there are 2, that's Frontenac Noir and La Crescent. And those were all things that were, well, the vineyards in the Champlain Valley had been planted before we came along, and we took them over, began leasing them. And the ones that we've planted here in the mountains, they were all things that had a good track record already here in Vermont. People were already working with them. They
Yeah.
had, an excellent survival rate. They were making wine. So they were the ones that, for me, seemed like the best bet, back in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. There are now a host of other
Nice.
varieties that are being planted here. There's one called Itasca. There's
Yeah.
Petite Pearl, Crimson Pearl, Verona. So some other interesting things. Lacadie Blanc, there's some Lacadie Blanc, which is traditionally planted up in Nova Scotia. It's finding its way here in Vermont, which is pretty cool. And there are always new things coming along that there are vineyards here that have test sites and who work with places like Cornell and University of Minnesota in trying new
Yeah.
varieties out.
Yeah. I'm actually growing a couple cuttings this spring of Marquette here in Los Angeles. So
Oh,
spreading
great.
s-
Great.
yeah, I'll see how that does here. Um
I think it
and
does
hope to be
actually.
doing some more.
Yeah, I think it does quite well in warmer climates. I know someone who's growing them in the high desert in Oregon, growing Marquette. Obviously, it's
Oh
cold
wow.
there in the winter, but I think that there's also
Right.
quite a number of plantings in Missouri and Arkansas, Nebraska.
Yeah.
Yes, places that also have some cold winters, but Arkansas is pretty temperate, so as is Missouri.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm
That's
excited. I
exciting.
hope to plant more. Yeah, I hope to plant more. Some of the ones, I mean, La Crescent, I've had so many beautiful wines made with La Crescent, yours included, and just think it's a fantastic white grape to work with. And
Yeah, yeah, thank
I
you.
mean,
I
there's
love it.
others. I mean, there's so many others.
So many others, so many
Tom, of
others.
course, we met in yeah, we met in person at Videnord, and of course, 3 of those hybrids that you mentioned are Tom Plocker's, and I've been emailing with him about getting Petite Pearl growing out here in California as well, or in Verona as well. He sent me a
Wonderful,
bottle of
wonderful.
a wine made in Colorado at like a mile high in the western, the Grand Junction area. That's actually it's like I think it's 95% Petite Pearl and Verona and 5% Mourvedre or something like
Oh,
that,
oh,
and
wow,
it's
cool. Very
stunning wine.
cool, very
Yeah,
cool. Yeah, well,
yeah,
my colleague, Camila, Carillo, who is the creative force behind, the label La Montanuela, and she and I work here together
yeah.
at La Garagista too. She's working with Verona and just released a really beautiful, sparkling red pet nat with it, blended with a little bit of Frontenac Gris, and, yeah, she's super excited to have and she's got Petite Pearl also in that vineyard. So, yeah, very
Oh,
exciting.
great. So how are these? I mean, you can talk about any or all of these. How are they doing viticulturally in terms of their neediness, and maintenance requirements, especially given the challenges of farming anything there in hot,
Yeah,
humid summers and
yeah, it's
now with
funny.
especially the variability that we've been seeing.
Right, right. It's funny when now that hybrids are so much a part of our wine conversation these days, there are a lot of people who have rightly so, um, really focused on their resistance their ability to resist disease, resist frost, and their resilience. But I think a lot of people think, okay, I can just plant these and then I can forget about it. Maybe if you were living in the south of
Mm.
France, you could do that. But
Or Los Angeles, I'm hoping.
or you're right, or Los Angeles, though you've had rain and you had some snow this winter, so things may be
That's true.
changing for you. I think
We
that it's
hope.
important to remember that they are, yes, they have a leg up in terms of resistance and resilience, but we have to remember that those things go hand in hand with good farming. And those things
Yeah.
become unlocked within the plant if we are paying attention to our farming. So, in a place like Vermont, which is cold in the winter, we have humidity in the summer. We have pretty high heat, very humid. We had a drought last year, for an example, but we can also have rain.
Mm.
And of course, nothing is as it seems or should be, seems like it should be anymore. So, traditionally, we've had to pay a lot of attention to fungal diseases because of water and humidity. And when we're in a season that maybe has a drought, those things are much less prevalent, but we still have to pay attention and be and also, I mean, we have to be paying attention because so in the past 15 years that I've been farming these grapes, I've had to look for these fungal diseases. But I know that any minute those things could change, and I have to pay attention to be ready for that. The wonderful thing that
Hmm.
I think that is so important about working with hybrids is their diversity, their genetic diversity, which allows for adaptability. And we're seeing, we have all these different circumstances that are kind of coming our way, whether it's rain or drought or humid, or cold or warmer winter. The vines are able to pivot pretty quickly and adapt themselves to whatever is coming along. They have this genetic grab bag that gives them information to be able to respond to their location, to the microclimate, to the microbiome. So while we still have to watch, be observant, pay attention to our farming, we do have this added bonus, if you will, not only of the resistance and resilience, but of the adaptability.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, no, I think so much of perhaps the um, stereotypes about hybrids came from people not treating them like as thoughtfully and as carefully as they should be treated, both viticulturally and in the cellar. It seems like revisiting some of the things that have been rejected and treating them with the sort of viticultural advances and knowledge that we have now, as well as the cellar skills, like cellar craftsmanship that they deserve. Turns out they make pretty good wine. Like turns out they
Yes.
aren't that bad. Have you
Yeah,
found that as well?
absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've always regarded them like, well, so my background is in Italian wine, and my specialty was Italian indigenous varieties, regional varieties. So my approach has
Yeah,
always been, these are my regional varieties. And why wouldn't I
right.
treat them in the same way that a wine grower in Piemonte or Chianti or Burgundy or Roussillon are going to treat the varieties that are traditionally grown there. So that was always my view. And, that is what we kind of set out to do and have continued to do. And I think is really important, wherever you are, you treat those, and whatever vines you have to treat them with love and respect, just like, any wine grower anywhere.
Yeah, Stephen Castles, he says, treat them like real grapes.
Yeah, yeah, yes, because they
um,
are real grapes.
yeah. So, what I wanted to mention, I mean, I wanted to just compliment. I think your photography is stunning. I mean, it makes the mood, it makes the emotion that I feel when I think about what you're doing because of the images that I know you've created to capture that. And I think that's such a gift, and I want to learn anything I can from you about how to do that. Any
Well,
advice
thank
about
you.
photography, please? But
Okay, okay.
also, um, yeah, but also, I mean, I think it would be beneficial for anybody who's creating a wine brand or a brand of any kind. Honestly, you have, I think, an immense amount to teach because it really is like anybody should just go to your website and just scroll through, and you can't help but feel like it's like, like when a story, you're listening to a good story, reading a good story because it's moving you, and that's like your photos do that as well with
Oh
everyone.
my
There's some
gosh, well, thank
emotion, some like
thank
very,
you.
it's very charged with emotion. I but also I wanted to mention, or wanted to ask you about your change of, well, not change of name, but this addition of a name to La Garagista of Domaine de la Forêt. And
Yes.
could you
Yes,
talk about why you did that and what that means to you, to the domain of the forest? Why is that meaningful?
yeah, yeah, and of course, I'm sure I've confused a lot of people with that, but I'm not confused, and I think that's probably the most important part. La Garagista, we are La Garagista. We will always be La Garagista. I think there's no escaping La Garagista. Um,
Right.
but when I started, that name was so applicable because, for a number of reasons. I was making wine in our garage. The garage had this was a symbol in a way, because our when we bought our farm, there was an original garage on the property, and when we bought it, that was the best looking building on the property. Over time, we worked on the house. The house became the better building, and the garage became this little ramshackle number. And Caleb, my husband, redesigned a new sort of barn garage, and he dismantled the old garage, which was made out of this beautiful Quebec cedar, and he started building things with it. He started building tables. Which we have all over the farm, these big long farm tables. We had them in our restaurant. He started building raised beds for our gardens with it. So it had this kind of
Right.
meaning of, regeneration, upcycle,
Mm,
reuse. Um, and that original garage
nice.
became this place that we grew things that contained these things that we grew in the garden, and then also this place where we would gather together at these tables. So there was that element, and then there was this element of the new garage, which at the time we built it, we had no idea that it would become a tiny little winery. But shortly after we did build it, it did become that. So we went from this, like the garage that became these other things centered around food and wine and farming. And then we started this wine project. And then, of course, there is the garagiste movement in France, which, while our wines are very
Right.
different than the style of wines I think that those producers made back in the late 70s and 80s, the ethos was the same of you can make wine anywhere and in any building. You do not need a great chateau. You do not need premier cru vineyards. You can do it wherever you are. And so those things,
Yeah.
were really uh, important parts of how the name La Garagista came about. And then, of course, ultimately it means the woman who makes wine in her garage. So super fitting,
There's a very literal
very
meaning to it as
literal,
well.
very, very literal. It also means a mechanic, which I'm not there yet, but
Oh, yeah.
I aspire to be somebody who's savvy about that. So, obviously over time as we've grown, we moved out of that original garage space. We Caleb designed and built a more formal winery for us that, interestingly enough, that early little garage space that was the first winery is now where our little tasting room is and where we do our pop-ups. Um, so it's still alive and
Right.
well. Uh, but we went from these little mountain vineyards to then leasing these other vineyards in the Champlain Valley. We planted a second vineyard here in the mountains. We had an opportunity in 2021 to purchase one of the vineyards in the Champlain Valley. And that had a little vineyard house on it, and it's got a little garage that we hope will be a fermentation space also. So as we've grown, I don't know, it just sort of struck me one day that it had become, and we're still farming vegetables here, and there are gardens, and there's the orchard, and the orchard is growing, that it was more than La Garagista. And we are
Mm-hmm.
on the edge of the forest here in the mountains. We're in meadows surrounded by forest. We're in a protected forest preserve called the Chateauguay. And then we are also on the edge of the lake and have forested area around our West Addison vineyard. And there's a pine grove right there. There's less forest around the Vergennes vineyard, but it was really kind of this idea, and it goes back to this idea that we talked about at the beginning, a forest edge ecology also, where the excitement takes place. And
Mm-hmm.
I am also a writer, and I am very drawn to the
Mm.
romantics. So, the domain of the forest, or even, as I think about as we grow more, it's almost like the lost forest, the forest that we are
Mm.
reclaiming, that we have a hand, that we can partner with to reclaim as a vibrant ecological landscape. This idea of Domaine de la Forêt encompasses all of what we do for me. It encompasses the food that Caleb makes and grows, the fruit trees that we grow that go into food and into fermentations, the wine that we grow, the food that we share with people, and the wine that we share with people here at the table at the farm. It's that's for me why this other name, to kind of envelop everything, uh, has become important.
Yeah. There's a really interesting turn. I mean, I don't know if you did this intentionally. I'm guessing you did. That La Garagista is sort of self-looking, and then this new name points outward toward the source. Is that something you considered as well?
No. But I love it. And I'm definitely gonna think about that now. I think most things that I do and that Caleb and I do together happen, very organically. We sort of find ourselves at the edge of a precipice, and it's not too hard to jump off.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's kind of how all of these things have happened. And I think there are elements that are wiser than we are that maybe lead us in
Mm.
philosophical directions, like what you're saying, because I think it is really apt.
Yeah.
The domain of the forest is that looking outward, connecting with the connecting with that natural outer world, and La Garagista is in the middle of that, right? That's my role
Right.
in it, or our role as a
Right.
team of La Garagista, our role.
Right.
Yeah, I love that. That's wonderful. You're giving me
Have
lots of good
you
ideas.
encountered the books of Have you encountered Diana Beresford Kroger's books or her talks or
um,
anything at all? Do you know her stuff?
yes, I do. My laptop is currently sitting on it.
Ah, fantastic.
Yes,
Which one?
sure.
The
The
Arboretum America?
to speak for the trees, and that is the
Oh,
one that
such
I'm
yeah,
reading
that's
right now. Yes, it's so good and so inspiring.
so great. Yeah,
Yeah,
she's yeah, it's a walk through the forest to just read her books. Uh yeah,
it
I'm
is.
very I mean, what you're talking about, this the domain of the forest, it recalls for me this connection that I made when I was in Rome. I also have like a special connection to Italy. That was another thing that we share. But
Oh,
in uh the 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 park in central Rome, I forget what it's called. You might know, but where the
uh,
Temple of Diana is,
yes, okay, yeah. The
the
Forum. Is
yeah,
that what
well, it's
you're
no,
thinking
it's
of
in
the
like
Forum?
it's sort of like Rome's Central Park, but it's called, I can't remember. I should look this up because I talk
Oh,
about it
it's,
enough. Um, but yeah, it's sort of just a giant park, even bigger than Central Park. You can roam all over. There's hills and trees and soccer fields and or things that get used as soccer fields, whether they are or not. Um, and gardens and things like that. And there is just this gazebo that's called the Temple of Diana, and the inscription on it is Noctiluce Silvarum Potenti, like to the mighty night shine of the forest. And
Oh, I
that
love that.
has
I don't
resonated
know
for me
that.
in a lot of different ways. And it's like yeah, I still don't even know what it means, but I actually named one of our wines Noctilucence in honor, in sort of like as a meditation on what that word means. And it became a word in English, and it's just amazing to me that we have this word that means night shine, and then that this
Oh,
inscription
yeah.
exists talking about the night shine of the forest. And yeah, I thought you might jive on that as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Something
Yeah.
something to look into.
Yeah. I
I also
love
love that the domain of the forest is the domain of the forest is that is like the forbidden place. It's the place of like don't go into the woods at night kind of thing, and
right.
the place of
Right.
fairy tales, and it's scary, and it takes courage to find out what's in there, and you have to sort of transgress
Yeah.
our normal sort of human limitations and things to get there,
Right. And
um,
it's
and you might
the
find some wild vines.
yeah, yeah. And it's the place of magic, right? It's a place of
Yes,
saying
yeah,
fairy tales, magic, transformation, and it's where everything starts. It's the origin, and
yeah,
I think that
yeah,
those are all really important things to contemplate, and to think about, and do the forest draws us in that way. It is both.
yeah.
The siren song of the forest. But you're right. It takes courage to enter into that forest because it's so much bigger than we are, and unknown.
Yeah,
It's like going to the bottom of the sea.
yeah,
It's unknown. We don't know what's in there,
yeah,
but we know it's the
yeah.
origin of some kind of energy or
Oh, I
magic.
love that you brought up the sea. I Yeah, it does to me seem like the terrestrial analog for the ocean is the forest in a
Yeah,
way.
yeah, I
Um,
think so. And I think that Rome
I
Park is it Villa Borghese? Is that what you were thinking? I think
That's
that's where.
it. That's
Yes.
it, Borghese.
Yeah.
That's it. Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome.
I I also love, I mean, I'm just now riffing on vines and the forest edge, but you think of like vines, grapevines particularly occupy this special place within any ecosystem in that they sort of weave together every story in an ecosystem. So like from the ground, from below the ground all the way up to the top of the canopy, the highest
Mm.
canopy, and
Mhm.
they can thrive at every level, and they can weave every level together into sort of like an integrated whole. But I sort of love vines for that as well. It's sort of my
Yeah,
fascination and love of vines.
and again, it's about that
Go on, go
adaptability.
on.
Yeah, it's about their adaptability.
Yes,
If they are left to their own,
yes,
if you plant a vine in the middle of an open field, it will crawl along the ground. But if you plant it on the
yeah,
edge of a hedgerow or the forest, it will climb up a tree. And it has all these different ways of surviving. It will either just simply grow bigger in order to survive, or it will make fruit in order to survive. And depending on what those
right,
circumstances are that it's growing in, it'll do one or the other and sometimes both. And they're really,
right,
they're preternatural in a way. Um, the way they climb, the way tendrils grab onto things. Uh, they're really fascinating plants.
Yeah. I love that they cling, but they don't strangle as well.
Right,
There's something nice
exactly,
about them
exactly.
that way. They've
And
learned how to play
historically,
nice.
yeah, right, right. And historically, thinking about, this idea of the forest and trees and vines, they were grown on trees as they're trellising.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so there's a very natural marriage between the two.
Yes, I'm hoping to revive that marriage actually with a piece of land in New York. We'll have to talk more about that. But
Yeah,
that's
that
yeah,
it's
I'd love to do
something.
a whole vineyard that
Yeah,
way.
likewise, likewise. Something I've been thinking about a lot as
Oh,
well.
fun. All right.
Yeah, yeah. So,
Oh, yeah, I mean, I'm glad it's out there. It's in the ether. It's
yes,
it's
yeah,
in the
it is.
soil.
It is. It is.
Well, can I ask you some practical questions? How so your mountain location is sort of your home base, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
A-
It's yeah.
And
We
then the vineyards down, sorry, the vineyards down by the lake are your satellite vineyards. Do you own those vineyards? Do you lease them? Are you farming them for the owners? How does that work?
Right. So here in the mountains, that's where we live. That's where the winery is, and our original vineyard, gardens, orchard, etc. We have a second vineyard here in the mountains, right across the street from the winery, that is land owned by friends of ours, and we farm it together. We incorporate the
Okay.
fruit from both sides of the street, work together to make a handful of cuvées from the home farm. Then down in the valley, we started leasing these two different parcels from the same gentleman back in 2013. In
Okay.
2021, we had the opportunity to buy one of those parcels, and that is the
Okay.
vineyard in West Addison. And it also has this little vineyard house on it,
Got it.
which we had been renting for a little bit prior to being able to buy it. It because it's an hour and a half
And how
away. There's a lot of commuting,
I was
so
gonna say, okay.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
it allows me, or if Caleb's coming over to help prune or do things in the gardens over there, that, we have a place to stay, we have a place to put harvesters up, we have a place for, winery guests to go. It's been a really great addition,
Yeah,
to,
great.
our life. Has made our life a lot easier.
Yeah,
And then we still lease the one vineyard in the Champlain Valley as well. So technically
got it.
we're leasing
Right.
two vineyards, one here in the mountains, one in the Champlain Valley, and then we are able to we have the we have the privilege to I hate using the word own. But
I
we
know, I know what you're struggling with. I
I'm
totally
really
feel
struggling
that.
with the
Yeah,
best way to say that. We have the opportunity to, uh, have these 2 properties, that we care for.
yeah. Yeah, I struggle with that same idea
Yeah,
as well.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
it it's funny when you I mean, especially when you think about the land, how I mean, ownership is such a weird thing.
It's such a weird thing. It's such a weird thing, and I think of it as having the opportunity to buy the privilege to work with the land, but there's no succinct way to say that when you're trying to describe something, like, simple and logistical,
Right.
right? Like,
Right.
do you lease it? Do you own it? Do you farm it for somebody else, to answer those questions? So, I'm working on it.
And and I just looking just a couple other practical questions about your viticulture. Do you find that you need to till? Are you working no till? Are you working with animals? I noticed a picture where you had crops. It looked like crops planted down the middle of a vine row and I'm wondering what that was and if you continue to do that. Just very
Yeah.
curious about these
Yes.
details.
So, my farming process has evolved to, if we are going to be planting a new area, We do break the ground to prepare it. We seed it with cover crop. We, try and take a year or two to get it properly prepared for accepting vines. Then I start to let the native cover crop come in. And ultimately, I want to be working in a given vineyard as much as I can, no till, and working with the native cover crop, because the native cover crop is what guides me and gives me information about what's happening at a soil level in the vineyard. It's how I make farming decisions based on the other plants that are cohabitating with the vines. By and large, we are no-till. There in the Champlain Valley, we are on really intense clay hardpan, about 1 to 3 feet above a lot of limestone and shale. So there are times, depending on what's happening and what's been happening cyclically over a few seasons, in which I find that the soil does need to be lightly tilled, to be broken up a little bit, to get some light and air in there, and to get some new plants. It's so that we don't get like a single plant starting to colonize, which can happen in really really heavy clay that is really dry in the summer and can get really compacted. So maybe I might till, say, in that for Jen's vineyard very lightly, just a couple of inches down, every 3 or 4 years, maybe even longer
Mm,
than that, as we see what kind of plants are. I mean, we certainly have lots of dandelions and wild carrot in that vineyard, which does a lot to naturally till. Creates those
sure, yeah.
macropores in the soil. But sometimes that it can just get really bound up, and you can see it affecting the fruit set in the vines. And when we start to
Yeah.
see a little bit of that happening, we will use, like I said, that light tilling. Uh, I'm really hoping we do work with sheep and rotational grazing. My hope is also that the work that they do will um, either allow us in those clay vineyards to not have to till at all, or to even lengthen that period of time in which we might find that we need to do it. And when I say that we till, it's like once a season if we're going to do that, in a
Right, right,
in that long period of time. It's not like tilling, every other week, or once a month or something like that. But I'm really the sheep, we've been working
right.
with the sheep. This will be our 4th year now doing the rotational grazing in all the vineyards. And their part of their benefit is to help work the soil. So we'll see. But we're
Yeah,
primarily no-till and primarily native cover crop. Oh, and you were asking about the vegetables. So or the plants growing down. So on the
yeah,
home farm, in the original vineyard, in the home farm vineyard, we do grow things between rows, whether that's flowers. We've done some vegetables, and that's a very old Piemontese technique where they would grow corn, beans, and other legumes between rows. They, had a more companion planting ethos in the vineyard. And I found that really
yeah,
interesting historically, and that was something that I wanted to try working with here. So at the original vineyard, everything is bleeds into each other. There are flowers and vegetables in the orchard. There are flowers and vegetables and vines together in the vineyard, in the flower garden, in the vegetable garden. We've got everything kind of speaking to each other, and we do a lot of experimentation with companion planting on the home farm vineyard site.
mm. That's yeah, I love that. And I it I just hadn't seen it done in such narrow rows before. So I
And I
wondered how
don't,
that worked out for
yeah,
you.
and I don't recommend that. Unless
Yeah.
maybe in LA, if it's drier,
Yeah,
if you're
that's
not having to
it's all
get
I've
in.
got to work with here. Yeah.
Yeah, if you're not having to get in there to spray for fungal diseases. I mean, I guess you guys do get mildew out there, but It's
Yeah.
when
Powdery.
so in the home farm vineyard, it is all experimental. So we have rows that are plants that are 4 feet apart and rows that are 4 feet apart, and then we have rows
Wow.
that are, much wider, wider planting wider spaces between plantings. And we did all of that to kind of figure out what we felt was the best ratio for doing all the things that we
Yeah.
want to do and for the plants themselves. And we've landed on, 6 feet between vines, 8 feet between rows. In the Champlain
Yeah.
Valley, excuse me, it was done much wider. It was planted before us, and I think we have 12 feet rows, and it's 8 feet between plants. And that I think was because people were trying to set themselves up for mechanical harvesting, if that was ever going to
Yeah.
go
That
that
makes
direction,
sense.
which is certainly not something we're interested in. But it is really interesting to see all the differences in planting and what the plants do within those circumstances. It's a lot of good data.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine with 4-foot rows, you're all hand tended in those rows at least. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, and it's a backpack sprayer, and we do
Right.
have a very small vineyard mower and tiller, so we can get in between. It just fits in between those rows if we need to use that for any reason. But it's pretty snug. It's pretty snug.
Yeah.
And particularly
Yeah.
for how uh, what's the word I want to use? Energetic these vines can be. Um,
Right. Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I,
Yeah. I
in
mean,
those
that's my
rows,
spacing here.
right? Yeah. In those rows, I'm not working as much with planting other kinds of crops, just because it is really hard to work in there. But
Yeah.
we have other rows
Yeah.
that are wider that we do that in.
Yeah. That's funny. Yeah. I did meter by meter in one vineyard, and I became so frustrated that I planted
Oh wow!
when I
Yeah.
planted again, I planted yeah, 4 by 5. I mean, you can't even turn around in a meter by meter
No,
spacing.
you
Like
can't.
it's like
No,
you're
exactly.
knocking off.
You
It's
have to go
crazy.
sideways.
I thought I would be very yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you just get covered with whatever you're spraying with. I mean, it's a great
Yeah, yeah,
incentive for organic organic sprays, but
exactly,
I just I would spray with cinnamon oil and then I'd come out and I'd be pink because, cinnamon oil is pretty, stingy to your
yeah,
raw
yeah,
skin.
yeah.
It's fun. Um so I you have been a big I mean I've said this to other people, but I think you've really helped steer the reputation of Vermont wine to being, for lack of a better word, fine natural wine, which I think is a great legacy. Not that you're looking for a legacy at this point in your life, but you're finding your way and still learning. But I think you've mentored so many people, and I think encourage so many people, if not mentor them in this what is becoming almost like what Vermont is known for, especially among a couple generations of the younger generations now who are starting winemaking or have been winemaking for the last few years. Can you talk a little bit about that community and what it's been like to be part of that from this early stage?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an exciting place to be making wine right now, because we have so much energy and a lot of young people doing the work here. And I consider myself as part of a continuum. I think I was mentioning before that there were a host of people who started wineries here back in the late 90s, mid to late 90s. And they put in the infrastructure. They planted, they trellised, they set up tasting rooms. They were definitely working with kind of a California concept of the tasting room, growing wine for the tasting room, tourism traffic. It was a way for Vermont land to be kept in agriculture and to create a value-added product that would allow the farmland to be kept in that current use. And there
Yeah.
were, some wonderful people who got that ball rolling. When Caleb and I came along, that had been the setup had been done, and I feel like we came in as part of a second wave, or the beginning of a second wave of producers who saw that there was potential to make really great wine here, and that this landscape had a lot to express through wine. And then, of course, we have what I would call the third wave, which are folks that have worked with us, who still work with us, who are now producing wine and developing labels and planting vineyards or taking over other vineyards, finding abandoned vineyards, all that kind of interesting stuff. So we've got this great kind of community tree, if you will. It's almost like, grandparents, parents, kids,
Yes.
ancestry,
Yeah.
whatever, we have some ancestors here, which is great. And we're a really small community. I think maybe there are 10 of us that are working in a, organic, biodynamic, natural wine ethos. But that's pretty great for a new burgeoning region, and that all of the new producers are choosing to work in this way. Um, I find that kind of amazing and incredible, actually, and that
Yeah.
it's as a model. I think that it is. I hope that it's inspiring to a lot of other places who are either starting out or have either been there for a long time and thinking about,
Right.
converting vineyard land to, more organic and regenerative practices. So, that kind of agricultural environment that we're in right now here is wonderful. And because we're small, we're able to be really supportive of each other, and that feels really special. And I'm not sure um, that it happens anywhere else in quite the same way. We're kind of, I usually hear about new wine regions that are at the place that we are. A lot of people have said to me, like, okay, you're about to go through kind of a rocky period. You're getting just big enough that, folks are going to start peeling off, and there's going to be a lot of difference of opinion. And it could be, it could be 10 years of a little bit of a rougher ride. But I kind of feel like it's the opposite, that we're becoming more all for one and one for all. And that is really, I find that really special. And that is one of the special things about being here in Vermont. And I mean, I feel myself, I am thrilled and amazed and inspired to be working with three other young women who have started their own labels and also devote their time and energy to La Garagista. Both Caleb and I feel really fortunate to have this incredible team, and then to be able to, in turn, support them and, offer them things like space and equipment and a place to work collectively. And we all have our own thing going. We all work for La Garagista, and then we also have collaborations that we do together. So I think pretty
Yeah.
unusual and wonderful.
Yeah, it's really I know it is very cool, and I have now talked to quite a few folks from Vermont because of I see the same very cool thing happening, and think it's a sort of a cutting edge for the potential future of where wine could head in that sense, because it's I always think that the being on the on the edge of what's possible with wine, because just of the natural climate and things that you have to deal with there, leads to innovation, leads to resilience. It leads to, a different kind of thinking
Yeah.
about it. It leads to new ideas and generation of different approaches. And I'm definitely seeing that happen. And I'm seeing that collaboration and supportive nature between, everybody that I've talked to. I mean, of course, I'm probably biased because everybody I've talked to is like 1 degree of separation from you or somebody else,
Right, right.
who
Yeah.
they are. But
Yeah.
but uh it's, it's definitely a very cool environment to see and be jealous of from the outside. um
Well, come to Vermont.
I I know, no, I had a great
Yeah.
time there. I definitely
Yeah.
want to come back.
Yeah, good.
It's it's fun. Yeah, I'm working on it. I'm
Good,
working on
okay,
something.
great, great.
Um, do you want to talk about any? I'm curious, just in terms of your winemaking, how it's maybe evolved, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about any of the wines that how your winemaking has developed and where you are with it now, and some of the interesting things that you're doing with your wine now. What your winemaking looks like.
Yeah, I had a kind of a revelation, maybe at the New Year or at the end of harvest last year. I guess it was at the end of harvest last year, and I wrote an essay about this, which was and I looked at a specific wine, and it was the evolution of a wine, and looking at how a wine that I started making in 2013 has evolved to how I approach it now. And I would say that, all of the wines that we're making have gone through similar kinds of evolutions, and that you can't help but have that in a new wine region, right? Because nobody's done anything ever
Right.
before. So
Right.
there's no information, there's no longevity, there's no history to fall back on, which is both exciting but also daunting. Uh, and you end up learning. Everybody ends up learning by the seat of their pants how to make a specific wine. I mean, we can take these techniques that we have learned from other places, that we read about, that we taste in other wines, and we can apply them, but we don't really know how they're going to work out until we've done that for a period of time over several years, and we make small variations in the way that we do them, and the season itself impacts how you do them. So when I first started making wine, my one of my mentors, a man named Bruno di Concilis from Campania in southern Italy, he said, your first official vintage that you're gonna make everything like an old Italian peasant. You're gonna, obviously hand pick, you're gonna hand a stem, you're gonna foot crush, you're gonna press in a little basket press, you're going to ferment everything in a demijohn, and you're gonna not use any additives. You're gonna do a really raw experience. And I was like, yep, that sounds like a good plan, right about where I am. And I did that first vintage in 2010, and I that is basically how I make wine now, um, with these variations that have happened over time, and as I've gotten to know the grapes from certain parcels better, and our equipment has changed, and the amount that we're making has changed, and the I've learned things from each season. I incorporate that information into the way I make each wine. And I've also been able to, in that process, have been able to become really interested in. Yes, I have this one basic technique, but then I have been able to start looking at other kinds of historical techniques. Like, for example, Camila and I have an oxidative wine project that we do. So we're both experimenting with rancio, where we age the wine in the summer in glass demijohns out in the sun in the garden. But we're also
Mm.
experimenting with floor. And we are very fortunate to have some really old sherry barrels to work with. So, that's
Mm.
a technique we're looking at. We're the technique of making cider co-fermentations or cider fermented on grape skins, which was something I read about in a really old library book, Italian library book. We
Hmm.
incorporate this idea of skins into other cuvées. So, for example, this year I am doing for the first time, I'm making a rosé from a white wine base that has both red and white skins from other grapes steeped in the wine. And
Ah,
that will be a new
ah.
rosé, and it brings, something interesting and different. They're all grapes from the same parcel, but just kind of a different
So
lens of looking at this wine.
would you
So
call that would you call that kind of a ripasso style of rosé, or is that a different?
Um,
Is I
I
don't know
that's
ripasso well
that's
enough to speak to it.
different.
I'm just
Um,
okay.
we have a true Ripasso style cider that I did as a collaboration with Willa, who is she helps manage our cider program here, and she has a label called Disciple. She and I this past year did an of early pick cider that we pressed through red and white grape skins, which is it's a pet nat, but that would be a true
Mm,
Ripasso. The steeping of the
got it.
skins, that's a I don't actually really know what that is in terms of using other grapes to steep in a still wine,
Right.
um, but it is the idea of that sort of, the basic, way that you make wine, of a wine fermented
Got it.
on grape skins. That's after it's been foot crushed. And I don't know if there's a precedent. I'm sure there is. We're not making anything up uh, of using other skins to incorporate into that kind of maceration. Um, but I work a lot with oxygen. Some wines that's very much a part of their personality. Other wines
Hmm.
are more, have a more reductive winemaking style. But I find all of that really fascinating. How each season brings something new to the table for each wine and helps refine how we work with that wine.
Yeah. It's time, I'm sure, has been an interesting educator as well, just in terms of seeing how these wines that you started making originally have aged. And I mean, I'm curious if that has actually informed any decisions that you've made now about, like, oh, now that I'm tasting this at 10 years old, I'm thinking I want to do this with it when I vinify it this time.
I think that the being able to taste the older wines has confirmed what we're doing because
Nice.
what we're seeing how the wines are evolving in bottle. We're seeing really great things, and I wouldn't I wouldn't change. That's not informing any changes that I would make. Changes are happening
Got it.
more with how things are happening in the field. Uh, as an example, we have this acre of Brianna in Vergennes, and it is, I don't know if you've ever seen or worked with Brianna, it's a really tight cluster, looks like a little hand grenade.
Oh,
And yeah,
oh, wow.
so, uh, and typically it doesn't reach a really high Brix level. It's recommended, I think, by the University of Minnesota to pick between 16 and 18 Brix. And I
Oh,
think
wow.
the highest it gets is like 22. But that it's not it's fruity. It's not so astringent like another variety might be at that kind of low Brix. That just happens to be its sugar
Right.
threshold. Uh, and if you pick
Right.
that at the beginning of the season, at the beginning of harvest as that tight little cluster, that works great. We noticed that if we let it hang, and because it has pretty thick skins, if we're dealing with rain, it will hold up really well during a rainy harvest. And we can pick it later. Uh, and as I said, those skins will hold up really well. However, if it's rainy and you've got this tight cluster, we can also see evidence of sour rot starting. We began doing
Yeah.
trials with pruning and not pruning in all of our vines in Vergennes. And we've now come to this conclusion of a way to deal or to farm the Brianna is that we prune half of it, and that portion we will pick earlier in the harvest season. And we don't prune the other half, which when you don't prune, that cluster extends and you get a lot more space between berries and you get more air circulation and you don't
Oh,
get the sour rot,
huh.
but you get the the integrity of the skins if you have this rainy or more humid harvest period. And we can pick that at the very end. We can pick it this past year we picked it third week of October. And we pick our blocks over a period of time anyway. We're not picking them all at once. So that allows us to blend together these earlier picks and these later picks, but to have better integrity of fruit during that span of 6 to 7 weeks that it takes us to pick that Brianna. So that's something that informs maybe the way we're divvying up that Brianna into different cuvées. The sparkling wine might be more predominantly the earlier pick. Uh, the this little rosé that we're making, middle to early pick, and then we have a wine called Loup d'Or, which is a wine that I'm actually hoping I'd like to start working with in Old Barrel. That later pick is seems like a good match for that. So
Hmm.
that's an example of how what's happening in the field and how we want to work it during harvest affects the decisions that we might make for a certain cuvee.
Can I ask the when you don't prune, you mean like a winter prune? So you're getting like lots of growth, I imagine, the following year. Are you hedging or anything at all? Like any
No,
like I'm
no.
just curious how that works out
Yeah.
and what do you do the following year?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, with the non-pruning, excuse me, our vines are old enough and have been farmed in the way that we farm them for long enough that they have some native balance. So, we're finding that
Okay.
even though we'll have more fruiting points, we might have longer shoots, that there is balance between vegetation and
Mhm.
fruit and that the fruit
Hmm.
is really very sort of perfectly presented to the sun. So we end up not having to do any hedging or leaf pulling. And that's something that has happened over time, and I think is based on vine age and on our farming methods. So
Yeah.
that seems to work, and we've been doing these trials. We started doing them in 2019. So we've been doing them for 4 years now, 5 years now. Uh, then what we've noticed is that you'll get a higher yield the first year that you do it. You get if you leave them unpruned, that second year will be a lower yield, and then the third year will be back to a higher yield. If you leave for 1 year
Wild.
unpruned, and this is for hybrids, I don't know how it shakes out with vinifera. It might be quite different. The first year, you get this higher yield. If we do a hard prune, that second year, we'll get a much lower yield. And then the third year, it's, kind of back to a normal. A third year with a normal pruning is a normal year. So we
Got it.
are developing a very kind of complicated system of of this cycle so that we basically
That's
have the
amazing.
same yield in a block every year, but we can afford in
Uh-huh.
certain rows to have a higher yield or a much lower yield depending on whether it's pruned or not pruned and where it is in that cycle.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. I are you in that Brianna, is it a top wire cordon trellis or how's that trained?
So all of our vines are a forearm niffin, which essentially looks like a forearm
Okay,
guillot. And with the top wire looking like a high cordon top
got it.
wire, but then there's another lower wire with two arms as well.
Right. And do they go up and down respectively? Like the bottom drapes down and the top lifts up, or are they both going up? sort
They
of
are
up and
so
out?
this
How
is
does
also
the
like yeah, this is also really interesting. So hybrids are considered to be semi-recumbent growers, which means that they grow kind of
right?
out and down. We have found that, and I would attribute this to biodynamics, that our shoots are growing up, and then they'll arc a little bit out, but they don't truly grow. They don't really grow down. They're always reaching towards the light.
Hmm.
And, um, early on in the farming, we did do hedging, and that is something that we found that we don't need to do anymore. That
Huh.
the vines really have oriented themselves, even when those shoots get longer, to the sky, which is it's pretty cool to see.
Huh. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for explaining all this. And honestly, I feel like we should do a whole second show just on your viticulture and winemaking practices because it sounds like there's a just a library of we could go, wine by wine and learn a new technique and different
Yeah, that
practice in
would
the
be
vineyard.
really
It sounds
fun
like.
and super interesting for me to sort of think about it in that
Yeah,
way.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but in respect of your time, we should probably wrap up. But I want to just ask if you could, let everyone know, how they could find out more about you and maybe try your wines and that kind of stuff.
Of course, yes, thank you. So we have a website, lagaragista.com, where you can find out just about anything you might need to know about us. I encourage people to sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the newsletter. That tells people when we're releasing wines on our on our online shop, and when those wines are available for curbside pickup. It also lets people know what our pop-up schedule is. We have just started after a 3-year hiatus. We're back up on our pop-up situation, and we're going to be doing those much more frequently in our tasting room and bottle shop. So we're super excited about that. And so people can order online, or they can come direct to us on those pop-up dates at those times to come buy wine here. Also we're distributing wine.
Is that in?
Oh,
Sorry, I
go
was just going to ask
ahead.
about the pop-ups a little bit more. Are they?
Yeah.
Is that sort of like instead of just being continually open for with regular tasting hours, you do these special tasting moments, or is it? Do you have tasting hours and this is beyond that?
The first and former.
Okay, got it, got it. So
We aren't in a position to have a tasting room open all the time, so
got
we,
it.
are now, I think, on a schedule of probably having being open 2 or 3 times a month in the bottle shop where you can taste things as well. And Caleb usually does like a little snack. We do things like, supper club or farm dinners, or where there's a little bit more food, but that's not as frequent. But that can be, and you find
Got
out
it.
about all that by subscribing to the newsletter. Um, but we are distributed throughout New England, of course, Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. We're also in New York. We are in California. We're in Quebec. We're in Mexico City. We're in Europe, UK, Italy, Germany, Austria, Spain, hoping France is going to be coming on soon. We're also hoping to work with someone in Minnesota for distribution, and as well as Pennsylvania this year. So we're starting to
Nice.
expand just a little bit.
Wow, you're cracking Pennsylvania. That's where I'm from. That's the state mafia state.
I know,
Good
I
for
know.
you.
Well, we'll see, we'll see. We're having a great conversation with a
Right. Good
wonderful
luck.
distributor
Yes.
there, but yeah, good luck, right? Yeah, exactly. But,
Oh, well, that's
people,
great. That's
we ship to almost all 50 states. So, that's the surefire way to do it online, or to come curbside, or for a pop-up.
got it. Well, thank you so much for this conversation and for what you're doing. I really appreciate all of it. And yeah,
Oh, thank you
Really
so much,
am
Adam. This has been
glad that
such
we
a
got a
great
chance to talk.
conversation. Yeah, me too. It's been wonderful.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. And I just want to leave you with this thought, or these two thoughts. You know, we will keep learning and changing until the day we die. And there are much more important things to our relationships with each other than whether we agree about some ideas. So have fun out there, enjoy, keep learning, and focus on the things that bring us together.